This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Greater Toronto Sewer and Water Main Contractors Association. Clean water, our goal, our future.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 76 of the Construction Record podcast. This is Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce, joining you today. This podcast is supported by ConExpo ConAg. Check out North America's largest construction show, which will hit the stage in Las Vegas from March 10th to the 14th of this year. With over 2,500 exhibitors, there's much to see and do during the show. As our loyal listeners and readers know, we are a supporting podcast of ConExpo ConAg, and both Warren Frey and myself will be down in Vegas reporting from the show, collecting relevant stories and interesting stories that we hope to share with all of you. And we know there's going to be a lot of people down there because this show is massive. It happens once every 3 years. And those of you that have been listening to us of late know we were always mentioning the early bird deadline, registration deadline, that anybody that registered by January 17th would receive 40% off their registration. Well, ConExpo reports that during that last week of registration, from January 10th to the 17th, over 38,000 individual registrations were recorded by them. That's 38,000 people registering for this show just in the last week of the early bird registration period. Gives you a sense of the scope and size of the show. Momentum does continue still to build for the show. ConExpo reports there's going to be over 500 new products and showcase innovations for asphalt, aggregates, concrete, earth moving, lifting, mining, utilities, and more. It's going to cover over 2.6 million net square feet of exhibition space. So obviously Warren and I are going to be having our most comfy shoes on to cover all that. In addition, there's going to be more than 50 show-related press conferences that have been scheduled and over 150 industry-driven education sessions, which are really important for folks that are going down there, not just to get intel, but to get that valuable, actionable, educational piece that they can bring back to their offices and their firms. This show provides that, and we're excited to try covering some of those sessions. So with that, ConExpo wants you all to know that you can still save 20% off show registration through March 9th of this year. So if you want to take advantage of that, go to conexpoconag.com to get more show information and to register. Still on ConExpo, the first part of this podcast is going to be the first in a series of ConExpo ConAg spotlights that we're recording and sharing with you, our listeners. For this particular spotlight for today in episode 76, I'm going to focus on 4 technology sessions that Warren and I are looking forward to covering and connecting with people on. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview. Maybe that'll entice you to come down to the show, or if you've registered for the show, it might help you decide if you want to go, yes or no. So with that, I'll start with a session that's happening on Tuesday, March 10th. It's called 4 Steps to Designing and Building More Resilient Infrastructure. Every year, natural disasters threaten infrastructure and human life. You don't have to read the DCN and the JOC to know that. Just read it in any commercial media. The greatest damage measured in repair dollars usually results from storms, research indicates. It's not only the high winds of the thunderstorms, but also the rain and hail that can cause damage. Hurricanes and flooding are the second and third most destructive natural events, respectively. 7 of the top 10 costliest disasters in U.S. history are hurricanes, says Lionel LeMay, Executive Vice President of the National Ready Mixed Concrete Association. Mr. LeMay is going to be holding this educational session on Tuesday, March 10th, called Pathway to Resilience, Concrete Solutions to Sustainable Communities. He'll be highlighting the different ways to design and build resilient and sustainable infrastructure. In particular, there's 4 themes that kind of govern his view, and those themes you can find in a session, but we'll give you an idea what they are. They are adopt an updated building code, adopt high-performance building standards, incentivize companies to build to higher standards, and build with robust materials. Mr. LeMay says resilience is the ability to plan for and adapt to adverse events. And he says our habit of building quickly at lowest costs does come with a cost. So the recommendations of the 4-step process, which I just outlined, are important. So if you want to learn a bit more, once again, that session's on Tuesday, March 10th at ConExpo ConAg, and it's called Pathway to Resilience, Concrete Solutions to Sustainable Communities. Another session which caught our eye that we find that we're looking forward to covering is happening on Friday, March 13th at the show. This particular session deals with artificial intelligence. So you've seen plenty of stories around the robots are coming, the drones are here as it concerns construction, but the use of AI and how do we incorporate it efficiently, properly, and safeguard that data that gets used with AI. How does this industry do that? Are some of the themes that we've covered in the past in our stories. And as it concerns this particular session, Ellis Talton, head of growth at Brick, a modern construction data analytics platform, is going to discuss the misconceptions about AI, how vital and useful AI is for the construction industry, and how people are already using the technology in their everyday lives. Talton and his team from Brick will be presenting the Tech Talk, Driving Decisions with AI at ConExpo ConAg on Friday, March 13th. So if you want to learn a bit more about that, I would definitely jump in on this session, looking at the outline for it. It's very interesting. Mr. Talton and his team are going to cover the themes of better business outcomes with AI, AI for the construction industry, and in particular, he has 3 tips to get you started in using AI to find better outcomes for your business. The 3 tips will cover focus on those outcomes, consider a service, and pick the right service. So if you want to learn more, try to attend this session. It'll take place from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Friday, March 13th at the Tech Talk stage at ConExpo Con. And the last session I wanted to highlight in this ConExpo Con spotlight for today's podcast is a session and a gentleman that we're very familiar with. We're familiar with this company here at the DCN and JOC. That's Procore. Kris Lengieza, Senior Director, Business Development at Procore. He's going to be presenting on Thursday, March 12th from 9:30 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. at ConExpo Con. His session is called A Construction Tech Odyssey from today to 2025. Just listen to that time frame. That's what catches me. From today to 2025. That's just 5 years. And that should be an indicator, a bellwether for all of us in this industry, whether we cover it and those who work in it. Change is happening rapidly. And trying to keep on top of it, trying to stay ahead of it is challenging. So sessions like these at ConExpo can be very helpful to construction stakeholders who want to learn more. So Kris and his show are going to cover a couple of different, his session, are going to cover a couple of different items, including the prevalence of mobile devices and new technologies in personal lives and the realization that these can be used out in the field, the growing labor shortage, the need for the industry to be more productive, younger people coming into the industry with new ideas and how to do things, and the last is the growth of technology and innovation companies. Nowadays, construction companies are welcoming and embracing innovation as old methodologies and science converge. New technologies improve efficiency, productivity, and profits, Kris says. So by way of example, he cites the use of 360-degree cameras, which are referred to as photospheres, to capture and document construction progress and check for safety issues, among other uses. He does note in an outline around key technologies for the construction industry to keep an eye out on and learn more about, and you can get a flavor for them at his session at ConExpo. Those key technologies that Procore and Kris are highlighting are these: virtual reality for training, augmented reality, robotic technology, automation technology, machine learning, and lastly, there we are again, artificial intelligence. So with that, that is our first ConExpo ConAg spotlight. We wanted to focus on some of these interesting tech and innovation sessions. If you want to learn more about these sessions, once again, we'll give you the website. Go to conexpoconag.com And you can learn a bit more about these sessions and their outlines and the speakers. You can do searches on our websites at dcnonl.com or joconl.com on some of these topics. We've covered them extensively through our 2 newspapers. And more than anything else, if you're on the fence about going to ConExpo Con, I would say dive in and go. It happens once every 3 years. You're not going to be disappointed. We haven't attended one yet, Warren and I, but we can already tell, just in the prep for us heading down there, that it is information overload, but it's learning overload. It's intel overload. It's stuff that you can bring back that's actionable back to your construction business. So with that, I'm going to throw to Russ and Warren in the Vancouver office. They're going to take you through what's happening out west and take you to our featured interviews for today. With that, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Vince. It's Warren Frey, Digital Media Editor for the Journal of Commerce.
I am staff writer Russell Hixson.
And we've had a whole bunch of stuff going on this week. I went to the CanBim conference, but first let's hear what Russell's got on the go.
Yeah, I mean, these should be out now. Buildforce has released their projections for the coming decade, and it's definitely kind of a mixed bag from what I'm seeing. We'll go over the first 2 that they've released, and they're up on our website right now. You have Saskatchewan, which it's looking pretty good, no horrible news. They're predicting kind of modest growth in the construction and maintenance industry, with the residential sector picking up pace as non-residential projects are completed. So they're not looking too bad, and their pace of overall employment declines is expected to stabilize early in the decade. And it while a lot of other provinces are facing kind of a really immediate kind of labor crunch, Buildforce, it looks like their data showing that Saskatchewan, if they can limit the outflow of skilled workers during periods of kind of weaker growth, they're probably going to have a pretty good shot at not having a acute labor shortage like some of these other provinces are.
Although that's been a perpetual problem for Saskatchewan, since time immemorial.
Yeah. It's a little bit of a different story in Manitoba. They're predicting that after around 20 years of just really, really strong growth, they're in for kind of more of a moderate start to the decade. It's going to kind of go down a bit. This is mainly due to kind of winding down of really major projects, and then there's also lower levels of road, highway, bridge, and kind of other new housing work. And so you're going to see kind of the construction employment shrink close to 4,000 workers, which is, a decline of about 10%.
That's surprising.
Yeah, so that's pretty significant. Yeah, so that's what's going on there. And then there should be a modest recovery, they said, later on in the decade. And these are all predictions. And then this is an article that's not out yet, but there's a company called a nonprofit called Homes for Heroes, and they have started building these tiny house villages they have one in Calgary, and they're planning to build one in Edmonton, and they support homeless veterans. So they're transitional housing for veterans who are on the street. And the people I talked to at the nonprofit estimate, the country has close to 5,000, maybe 6,000 veterans who are either homeless or couch surfing or just in a bad way when it comes to housing. And they designed these villages in an interesting way, kind of around a therapeutic idea that when these people come back from the military. Often they want like kind of a barracks style arrangement. Okay. So they want their own privacy and their own space, but being in like a community of other people is really, really important.
That's interesting, because what immediately sprang to mind for me is when they have those villages for old people with dementia, and they're sort of designed around that. And this is kind of like that, but different, because it's hewing to a different set of conditions for these guys.
Well, he said that's...
And women.
What I chatted with, they said that it's not even just with military veterans. For a lot of other different segments of the population, there's a lot of isolation, and that can cause a multitude of problems when people isolate themselves, especially the elderly as well, where they get older, they have a place that's big and hard to maintain, and they don't get out much, and they kind of deteriorate and have a lot of loneliness. With veterans, it's similar, but also if they're struggling with some sort of issue, whether it be substance abuse or depression or something, having people like right there around you who can see when you're not coming out of your home in a while, they can check up on you and make sure everybody's doing okay, is really important.
Group cohesion is kind of the keystone to military life, right? So it makes sense.
And so their goal is to get one in every major city in the country. So now,
how big are these tiny homes?
They're not very big. They're pretty small. I don't have an exact square footage for you.
But
they're fabricated.
Okay.
They worked with PCL and ATCO, so they can build in kind of these dense urban areas really, really quickly.
Oh, good.
Just a matter of months, they can get one of these up, so you don't have like disruptive construction going on all the time. And so they're right now they're getting some rezoning done in Edmonton to hopefully get that up and going. And they want to see more and more of them all over the country. And he says they want to completely end homelessness for veterans. And they aim for these to be kind of transitional housing. So there will be counseling and other support on site for people. They can just have like immediate help. And each person that goes to one of these villages, they will be met with and have a whole program of transition developed specifically for them. So it's not like you can only stay here this amount of time, whether it takes 6 months, a year, 2 years, they will work with whatever the person's specific needs are to try and get them to a better place.
That's great. So as for what I've been doing, I went yesterday to CanBim's 2020 Vancouver meetup's the wrong word for it, but it's a conference essentially. It goes over 2 days, and they have a bunch of speakers from a bunch of different places. They had a guy in from the UK talking about what they're doing with BIM, which is in some ways they're kind of ahead of us, and in other ways, a lot of what's happened with the UK construction market is they had the Hackett report, which is to do with the Greenfield Tower, and it's a terrible tragedy with the fire that happened, but it's also kind of made them stand back and go, how can we design things better? How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? And a lot of that is designing a lot of collaboration to begin with, so you don't get problems like you have with Greenfield or otherwise, where people aren't talking to each other, which was the main thing they talked about across all the seminars, how people need to start talking to each other in the different, and BIM is one of the ways you can do that. The other interesting thing about it was that BIM used to be, you'd hear about BIM and it'd be like, you should really try this, you should really try this. Well, that war has kind of been won. People are doing a lot more of it, but now it's more talking about interconnectedness and more about the life cycle of building than the actual, because they've gotten to the point where, yes, they are using this for design, it makes more sense. But also they're talking about how, okay, now how does the owner deal with this? And it was much more owner-centric than it's been in previous years that I've been to this conference.
When you hand the keys over, you hand them over also like all this data and all this stuff that they can use.
So what do they do with that? Or for instance, you'll hear later, I talked to Larry Harder, Executive Director of Planning and Projects for Fraser Health, and he goes into detail as to how this hospitals are the perfect example because they cannot shut down. Like the only time a hospital shuts down is when one has been built right next to it or somewhere nearby, and that one goes on perpetually. And so of course they've got much more exacting standards than almost anybody else, and they have much more chance of failure with equipment because it's just on all the time, right? And they have even stuff you don't think about, like he talks about in the interview that you're going to hear later, about how they have AI and BIM sort of working around the best pathways for people to go through in the hospital because it's such a coordinated activity, and even with in case of emergencies, how is the best way to evacuate people who are maybe incapacitated, and how is the best way for firefighters to get in and out of the place if it's on fire. Like they figure all this out ahead of time, so it's there. As opposed to, I guess we're dealing with this now.
And there's data behind it. It's not just someone's opinion about
it's
the best way to do it.
It's number crunching to figure out the best way to do this, and then having AI look at it and go, this is the optimal path, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So it's all quite fascinating and not stuff you think about, but they have to think about all this when they build a hospital right at the beginning, when they do. So I also talked to Thomas Strong, who's the president of CanBim, and he talked about the conference and what's happening with BIM generally in Canada and overseas, and you're going to hear this interview right now, followed by Larry Harder.
This feature interview is brought to you by the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association, Ontario's champion for sustainable and safe water and sewer infrastructure.
I'm here with.
Tom Strong, CEO, President of CanBim.
Okay, and we've just come out of the first day of the CanBim 2020 conference, and one of the things I've noticed is this is less about let's get people to adopt BIM and more we've gotten them to adopt BIM. Now here's some other challenges we have and also opportunities we have. So maybe you could speak to that because that seems to be part of the program.
Yeah, I mean, the organization has had a really strong focus on building information modeling, as you know, and we view that as a common data environment for buildings and infrastructure projects, and that's really the foundation for a lot of other technologies, related to our industry, and there's a whole ecosystem of now products and tools, et cetera, that are tying into that subject matter. And what we're seeing also is that our membership and the industry at large is kind of grappling with an overall digital transformation that's happening. We've seen contracts evolve to be more collaborative. We're seeing those contracts enable a different approach to risk transfer and procurement, which is going to enable people to work in a more integrated way. So we want to, we have been expanding our purview to be inclusive of this, and a lot of our membership in the industry they're trying to figure out how to utilize these tools to collect data, to utilize that data, and improve their decision making, and also how do you culturally shift your business to be more, inclusive of these tools and whatnot to get the best out of it. So it's an interesting time, and you attended the owners summit this morning, and obviously there's a lot more interest from sort of decision makers and end users coming into our environment now, saying how do we utilize these tools? How do we ask our service providers, our contractors, our architects, engineers, et cetera, facilities managers to utilize this technology? So they're really wrapping their head around it, and they're investing. And they really care about the subject.
The next thing I would ask is this the first time you've really emphasized owners? Because it's been more about the technology as I remember it, and this is more about, hey, owners, get in on this in the ground floor.
Yeah, well, I mean, not really, to be honest. Like, we have been, the organization's 11 years old, give or take, and since day one, we've always been trying to drive, government entities, procurement entities to participate, and also, obviously, the private sector, developers, the pension funds, and whatnot. And I would say just in the past couple of years, there's been a lot more interest. I think, overall technology is making an impact in all of our lives, and we're starting to see more and more of the groundswell of activity around this subject matter, and I think that's driving it. And I think it's also just, people are very interested to understand how technology can drive innovation in their businesses and how they can get, more square footage for their spending dollar. How can it improve the process that we all deploy to build our civilization, right? So I think just there's a groundswell of activity around this subject, and the owners are now really starting to pay attention. And it's a very interesting time. Like, the next few years will be very interesting.
It seemed to me that there was more of an emphasis on, okay, we've got the design part down more or less. Yeah. It's now more about the life cycle. Yeah. And that seemed to be sort of something that's kind of, maybe that's an industry-wide trend too, but it's like actually it is. But here definitely it seemed like, well, there was the owners saying, well, how do we maintain this thing now that we've got it and all digitized?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big shift. There's, you can read some stats. I don't quote them exactly, but I've read stats where the cost of maintaining a building over its life cycle is much more significant than the cost of actually building the product. And obviously, the whole world is concerned about the impact of climate change and the amount of carbon we're producing. So everyone is more interested in producing a really efficient product from an energy standpoint. And they want to maintain their product and run that asset in the most efficient way possible. So that's leading. It's kind of charged up this idea of smart connected real estate and smart cities, and the IoT strategy that is now being thought about at the early stages of design, and that all ties into the model, the building information model that contains all the data related to the asset. And so all these kind of movements are converging where people want to understand how do we connect these sensors in buildings to the 3D model of the asset we have, and how do we utilize that data to drive efficiencies and create value. And the other kind of big movement around the life cycle is that contracts have evolved where the builders now have that maintenance responsibility over a longer term because of the P3 model. So there's a lot more interest there, and I think from a public perspective with government agencies that manage a lot of assets. There's always pressure on budget to keep costs low, and that's created a large deferred maintenance liability for a lot of these public owners that own many assets that are potentially like underperforming, that need a lot of refresh of the mechanical systems and envelope. So they're really just trying to figure out how do we utilize our budget in the most efficient way? How do we manage all this deferred maintenance liability? How do we prioritize, and what can technology offer? So I think that's kind of driving this interest too, where the owners are coming to the table and trying to work, engage the industry to figure out how to address that problem.
And finally, you got an international perspective this morning, because the first panel was a guy from the UK talking about how they've dealt with BIM, and a lot of it was driven by that report, I think the hacker report about the Greenfield Tower, and so maybe you could, and how that's actually driven a lot of innovation. So you can speak on why you brought somebody from the UK in the first place to bring stuff.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we're obviously working in a global environment now. These markets are very interconnected, and the UK has been pretty progressive, driving the use of BIM, at least, publicly from a government perspective, saying, thou shall use this technology because we think that it's in the public interest to bring down the cost of infrastructure. And the industry is working in an efficient way. This is technology that can enable better efficiency and that can create a public good because you get more infrastructure for your purchasing price. And they very deliberately kind of drove that because they wanted to change the way the market behaved. So they baked that into their procurement policies and whatnot. And then, from our perspective, we're, CanBim has a great relationship with Building Smart Canada, who's connected to Building Smart International, and there's all these chapters all over the world. And there's a number of organizations similar to CanBim that operate in the U.S. and around the planet too that have more industry focus. So, through those relationships, we're able to pull in experts from around the world and get different perspectives, which is very valuable. And that particular project, as you know, it was a major fire.
Yeah.
It was a horrific thing.
Driving a lot of change now.
People died, and as a result of decisions that were made. And I think everyone is interested in making the best possible decisions, considering all factors, and utilizing technology to aid in that decision making is obviously something that's got to be explored. So that's when you make decisions on how a building is designed and what materials you use, these things cost a lot of money to put it together, and then you might have a long-term issue if you make bad decisions. So I think that's what's driving that interest as well.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm here with...
Hi, I'm Larry Harder. I'm an Executive Director of Planning and Projects for Fraser Health Authority.
And we're at CanBim 2020 in Vancouver, and you've just done a talk about BIM from the owner's perspective, which is something I don't often hear at these conferences, so maybe you could speak to the owner's perspective generally, and then Fraser Health specifically.
Okay. The contractors and consultants have been really working on BIM for the last 10 years, and now the model is well understood. It's time for the owners to identify what they want out of a BIM model. It's really up to us to think about how to utilize facilities information to make our facilities more efficient and safer.
And you mentioned in your presentation that Fraser Health, or any hospital really, is open 24 hours a day and is one of the more complicated buildings you can think of. And how does BIM sort of play into that?
Because it doesn't shut down, and there's a failure. I mean, obviously components run out, and being able to anticipate them, forecast them, or prevent them is critical. Because if we have to shut down an OR room or not be able to take on patients because some critical part of the facility fails, there's very little tolerance for that. So BIM does allow us to have that as close to instant and accurate information to get over those problems as quickly as possible.
And you also cited one particular scenario where there's an emergency. Let's say you have to evacuate the hospital, something's on fire or whatever, and there's first responders, and you said that BIM helps you sort of plot out routes of escape, and there's more intelligence you can apply to that.
Absolutely. If we just up the way we track patients, they're given a identity bracelet when they come in. The additional intelligence could be added to that. Staff could also have that same intelligence added to their ID badges. And if that's tied into a BIM program with a little bit more analytical intelligence, when a major disaster happened, if an earthquake collapsed a part of a hospital, hopefully the on-site people or somebody within the system would say, okay, we've identified where the problem is, here's where our people are, this is where you should go and start to rescue them.
And you also mentioned that it's more a question of, well, first of all, the owner has to be way in front of this thing. Like, you have to tell these guys who are building this thing what you need way before they ever get to that, yes, in order to have your purpose served. But also you said, while the building is going, that's when BIM is really important, is because it's not just clash detection, it's making sure these critical things keep working.
Absolutely. There's needs for BIM at each of the critical stages of the life cycle of a building. Clearly, during the planning, again, the owner has to be very clear about what they want. And for us, if that's included into the BIM program, it's easier to do reconciliation. If I want a bunch of rooms this size and I want this equipment in there, it's a quick report to say, yeah, I'm getting that. So that gives me a compliance tool. Certainly when it's in construction, there's clear advantages. Less so much from the owner, but the architect and the contractors can work things out. I think what I was emphasizing today, it's during the operational phase of a project that we really, if that information isn't in there, I don't have it to use for the next 50 or 60 years.
And you also mentioned that in terms of information stuff, which we don't think of because it's just a functioning building, you walk in and it works, but you have to think about this. Information and Wi-Fi points are critical. Maybe you could explain why that is in a hospital, the obvious reasons, and how you do that with BIM.
It's not hard to identify. Like I said, we started off tracking 13 critical components, like boilers and HVAC systems and things that just keep the blood of the building flowing. But clearly that's now grown to, like I said, 2,200 in the last project. It's really, they're identified through risk management. Look at each component and what would happen if it failed. And if it causes any disruption to the day-to-day functioning, then we want to track it. Things like, door hardware and stuff like that, we probably don't need to get down into that level because the risk around that is not that significant.
And also, you said that for 10 years, Fraser Health has been sort of putting out documents explaining this is what we need, and that seems a little ahead of the game to me compared to most people.
Well, when I say 10 years ago, when I joined Fraser Health, I had come from a couple other institutions in the States and abroad that were using BIM. And when I came, it was not even being discussed.
Yeah.
So at that point is when I started to sell it. And it's probably taken, the first 5 or 6 years, probably around 2010, where all of a sudden I could prove from a risk prevention point of view that this was worthwhile.
But you listed off, I think it was a lot of buildings that are using it now, and it seems like you're kind of, maybe I'm guessing here, one of the leaders in this space?
Clearly we are. Certainly in public institutions we are, because I think we have a greater need to pursue it, yeah.
And what do you see in future, like let's say the new St. Paul's, for instance, how would you, I'm sure there's proprietary information with that, but just generally speaking, how would you tackle a whole new canvas, I guess?
Right. So with St. Paul's, they have their own standalone team. Our BIM team is available to all of the major projects, and they're just in the exploratory stage. So there's no doubt that, again, the consultants and contractors are going to use it, and the owner is starting to identify how they want to capture their information. I think that they're looking at maybe a little bit different approach from what we've done in the past. We try to document what it is and how you're going to give it to us. I think they're going to take an approach that this is what we want. You tell us how you're going to do it.
Okay, good. Thanks.